G'day, James here. In this video, we're going to do our first VBA macro. This is not going to be special, it's just going to be a basic macro for formatting and then another macro for copying, for moving columns around, all right? This is really just to get you started and just to show you the power of macros and how we can record a macro. In later videos, we'll go into more depth as to where you can save them in different workbooks, etc., and where we can put these macros and how we can edit them and change them, all right? This is really just enough to get you started. Okay, so what you should see in front of you now is just Excel, and we've got some random names spread across 5 columns. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is if we have to record a macro, what we need to get is we need to get the development tab up on the ribbon. Now, to get the development tab, if you haven't got it already, is I'm just going to right click on the ribbon and go customize the ribbon. And when I customize the ribbon, you can see I can choose the developer tab, and then I can click on OK, and I now have the developer tab. When I click on the developer tab, I can see a whole lot of options here. We're going to focus down in this corner down here where you see Visual Basic macros, record macros. We'll go through a lot of these in further videos. I'm not going to go into macro security in depth, just to say that if you click on macro security, the setting you want to make sure is set is disable VBA macros with notification. So what will happen is if you open a workbook that has a macro in it, you should see a button to enable the content or not. If it's disabled without notification, then you're not going to be seeing that notification. So you can just check that when you check in macro security. We'll talk about all of these other options in a different video. So the first thing we're going to record is we're just going to change the formatting of some cells. That's all we're going to do, is change the formatting of some cells. All right, so you can see here, I'm going to select a range of cells, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on record macro to record the macro, and I'm going to call this format cells, and I'll put ABS at the end, and I'll click on. Now you can define a shortcut, you can put in descriptions and all the rest of it, choose where to store the macro. We'll cover all of that later. At this stage, we're just going to record the macro. So I'm going to click on record, and now the macro is recording every single keystroke I do. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color to red. I'm going to change the background color to a blue. All right, and then I'll change the font to bold. All right, and so I've done that and I've recorded my macro. So let's now stop recording. All right, and what you can see here is you can see that macro's been recorded. And if I move to another set of cells here and run the macro by pressing Alt F8 or clicking on this macros button, and then if I run the macro, you can see I've changed those cells. And I can even select multiple cells across the... Right, I'm holding down the control key to select non-continuous ranges, and then I can click on macros and I can run the macro and change those. All right, so we've recorded our first macro. Let me just clean this up. And so now we need to go and look at that macro that we've recorded. So the way we do that is we're going to go to the Visual Basic Editor. Now the quick way to get that is just to press Alt F11, but you can also click on the button. So I'm going to click on the Visual Basic Editor, and you can see the editor will come up now. Yours should look a little bit like this. You can go and watch my video on configuring the environment to see how I like to set this up, but you set that up. And then in our Project Explorer on the left-hand side here, you'll see you've got modules. And if I expand that out, you should see module 1. And if I double click on it, you should see the macro that we have just recorded. All right. You've got some stuff at the top, which is just comments. Right. And again, we'll go through that in a separate video later on. But you can see these are the things I'm doing. I'm going to get the font and I'm going to change the color of the font. So that's changing the color to red. Then I'm getting the interior of the cells or the range I had. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a solid pattern in there. I'm going to put a particular theme. I'm going to put a particular shade, and I'm going to set that. And then the last one is I'm going to set that to bold. Now you can see with all of these with all of these steps, I'm doing it with the selection. And what you can do, and again, I'm just showing you now, but we can show it in more detail later in a separate video, is I could literally step through this macro and run it as I run it. All right, so you saw we ran it before by clicking on the macros button, but let me just select a few cells here and go back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'll put a break. I'm going to step into it. That's what I'll do. I'll step into it. And you can see I'm going to step through the macro that I did. And if I step through it, you see I've got the selection.font, and I'm going to change the color. And see how it went red? Then I'm going to go to the selection that I've selected, and I'm going to set the pattern to solid. So you should see it all block off now. And you can see it's been solid. Now I've got to add a tint and a shade to bring it down to a lighter blue. All right, and then I'm going to change it to bold. And so I've been able to step through that macro. Now, with this particular macro, we didn't have to worry about specifics because it was just working on whatever we selected. So it didn't really matter whether we were recording it relatively or absolutely. All right. The next macro that we record, however, we do need to think about that. Okay. So let's look at recording another macro, and in this macro what we're going to do is we're going to change from one column and we're going to copy column B in between columns C and D. All right, so we're going to record a macro that does that. All right, again, I'm going to leave on, I'm not going to click on use relative references. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to record the macro and I'm going to call it swap columns, and this will be ABS. All right, swap columns absolute. All right, and I'm going to select column B. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go cut, and then I'm going to click on column D and I'm going to right click and I'm going to insert the cut cells. All right, so I've just swapped columns B and C. See how column B is now column 3 and column C is column 2. Okay, so let's stop recording now. Okay, and so what we've done in that process is we've swapped the columns, everything looks great. Let's go back to our Visual Basic Editor then and look at the code that was written. All right, so you can see down here, we've got our macro that was written called swap columns. And you can see here that it says select column B, cut column B, then select column D, and insert shifting to the right. Okay. Is this macro going to work in all cases? So again, let's go back to Excel and let's now click on column 1. All right? And we want to swap column 1 with column 3. So let's click on macros and click on swap columns and click on run. Hang on a minute, it swapped column 2 and 3 back again. All right? So this is because the macro is referring to specific columns absolutely. It's not referring to them relative to where we are. All right, so let's try and do that again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on column 2 and re-record the macro, but I'm going to re-record it relative to where we are. All right, so this time I'm going to click on use relative references, Then I'm going to click on record. I'm going to call this swap columns relative. And this time I'm in the column I want to swap. So I'm clicked in the column I want to swap. So then I select the column relative to where I am. I select the column. Then I cut that. And then I go across 2 columns and right click and insert the cut cells. All right. So I was doing it relative to, when it was getting recorded, it was being recorded relative to where I am. So now I'll stop recording and we'll go and have a look at the macro I did. So again, let's try it now. So see, okay, this is a good, let's just test it. So I'm in column C at the moment. I want to swap column 2 with column 4. Right, remember when we recorded absolute, it just went back and swapped these 2 back again. So now I want to swap column 2 with column 4. Let's just click on macros, swap columns relative and run. It did it the way I expected to do it. So let's look at the code that got recorded. So I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic Editor. And you can see in the editor here that what's happened is we've got our second macro. And rather than selecting a column absolutely, so in our first macro, you saw that it selected column B. It's always going to select column B. But you can see in our relative one, it's saying relative to the active cell, go to the 0th column, the first column in the active cell, get the entire column and select it. All right? Then it just does the cut like the previous macro did. Then it's going to take the active cell where we are, go 2 columns across. All right, so that's what this 2 is saying. Go 2 columns across and then select the 0th column, the first column in that, select the entire column and select it. And then this is the same as our previous macro. So hopefully from these 2, you can see that the way you record your macro can have a totally different effect in the way it is run, whether it's recorded absolutely or relatively. Now I have another video on relative versus absolute for cells in an Excel spreadsheet to get this concept of relative and absolute. Okay, so what you've seen now is you've seen our a different way to create different macros, and I'm going to just go back into column 1 and we'll go back and just run it again so we can do it. I'm going to click on relative and I'm going to say swap the columns, yeah, and then swap column 4 with column 5. We can swap the columns again and we can see we've swapped all of our columns around. All right, so hopefully in this video you've seen how to create just the basic bare bones of recording a macro. The very last thing you have to be aware of though is this macro got recorded into this workbook. So when you save this workbook, you can't save it as a standard .xslx file. What you need to do is save it as an XSLM file, a macro-based file to save it. Okay, so when we go to save our workbook, we'll click on File, and then we'll click on Save As. I'm going to save it to this PC, and I'm going to choose a name, but I'm going to save it as a macro-enabled workbook, an XSLM. And that way, when I save it, it will save the macros in with it. Alright, so in this video, you've seen how to create a basic macro. We've shown how to get to the developer environment and view the macros. In subsequent videos, we'll see how to pull those out and step through them and debug them and change the code to be more specific on what you do. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and see you in the next one.